And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Natalija Bitiukova. Natalija is a global privacy leader at IKEA retail company. She is working with data protection compliance within multinational companies on an everyday basis. So she has a long track record and, of course, a deep insight how actually privacy compliance in the multinational companies looks like and how to implement that. Today, Natalija will look into the challenges of measuring enterprise privacy maturity and compliance in changing regulatory landscape. She will discuss such conceptual differences between the maturity as such and compliance, and will provide us good examples of maturity models and that can be used by global companies. So, stage is yours, Natalija.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tatiana, for introduction and for the organizers for inviting me to this event, for all the speakers for very interesting presentations so far. My intervention is going to be rather practical and focused on privacy maturity assessments and measuring in the corporate environment, especially from the perspective of the in-house privacy function. So I'm going to talk to you about why to measure privacy, what exactly are we measuring, how to measure it, and how does data ethics actually fits into this whole discussion. So why to measure privacy? When we're running privacy function, it's like running a small organization in the big organization. We have people, we have budget, we have training, we have internal clients, we have requirements, we have suppliers. And running organization is not binary. You can do it better or you can do it worse. But in order to understand where you are, you need to be able to measure and explain in order to know how to get to the next point. There is, of course, increasing requirements of internal and external reporting and privacy having a seat at the ESG reporting and board wanting to know where the organization stands in this area. It is, however, and I have to underline, not only about GDPR. When board or top management wants to understand privacy posture of the company, especially multinational company operating in different environments, it really matters the fact that we're seeing increasing legislation across different countries in the privacy space. Adequately resourcing privacy function is another element. You want to be able to understand whether the resources that you have are enough to meet the demands. And in order to know that, you want to be able to predict the demands in the future, if possible. And this is where measurements really come in handy. What exactly are we measuring? So there is no size fits all, and each company kind of has a different take on that. Some talk about gaps, others about risks, some talk about compliance, and others about maturity. From my perspective, compliance is a very important, typically a goal of the company. Sometimes it's going beyond compliance, which is another type of the goal in itself. But compliance is much more suitable in understanding whether your processing operation or activity or set of actions or technology is actually meeting regulatory requirements, not the fact that your privacy program is performing well or not so well. In that case, maturity is a much more reliable characteristic because it allows you to set up controls that are going to support all your compliance activities and have a very detailed and granular measurement per control as to how you're performing and in which direction you're going. In terms of what has been developed so far, there are a number of privacy maturity frameworks, and I put on this slide just a couple of them for your information. You can see that one of the most popular frameworks was developed back in 2011, ACPA, by the sort of professional associations. We also see examples of privately developed framework and a couple from the governmental authorities. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that just a couple of months ago, CNIL, French Data Protection Authority, put in place a privacy maturity framework themselves, which kind of shows this interesting move from the European regulator side to acknowledge the value of measuring it. And what they said, I think it's really fair and points to this good distinction between compliance and maturity. is that the framework that they are suggesting is not created to measure compliance, but it creates conditions for the implementation of lasting privacy activities. And that kind that goes to the heart of what maturity frameworks are about. I'm not going to go, and I don't have time, unfortunately, to go into detail framework by framework. Someone else has done it for me, and I'm acknowledging the source here. But generally, in each framework, you kind of have two elements. First is the one that sets maturity levels. Normally, it's something between level 1 and level 5, right? And some have level 0 as well. Level 1 represents ad hoc maturity, whereby your process might not be developed. You're doing everything on case-by-case basis. So that's the lowest maturity level. And level 5 is the optimized one, whereby your process is well-resourced, is timely, it's compliant, and it can effectively deliver day on day the aim that you have set. And the aim is typically something around compliance. And another part of the maturity framework is kind of high-level controls or areas. So something that you would typically see in each privacy compliance program, something around assessments and trainings and individual rights requests, transparency, lawfulness, and all other elements. It is, however, worthy to note that frameworks that are existent normally do not have some of the elements that the framework that you want to create for your company ideally should have. And that is around control specifications, so detail level, how exactly you're expecting people outside of the privacy function to execute all the controls. Because if the company is large, you will not have a privacy person on every processing activity. That will not be feasible. Target maturity per control, how far do you want to reach and which maturity level you would like to reach with each of the processes. And of course, there is no point of perhaps aiming for level 5 across all of the processes. Let's say if you're never receiving data portability requests, then ad hoc level might be sufficient. If you're receiving 10,000 of data access requests per year, a process for access requests, you might want to aim for level 5 in order to reduce the risk of mishandling as much as possible. And lastly, the metrics that I'm going to come to in a second. So here is sort of visualization for you as to how you can move from this external or internal requirement, for that matter, down to the controls, high level of control, more detailed level of control, target maturity level, and to the metrics. And on the metrics, I would also like to highlight that outcome metrics are important, but if you really want to start looking into the trends, then the trends and activity metrics are equally valuable. But the reason why I really like maturity frameworks is that they can accommodate a multiplicity of different compliance requirements. And as mentioned, we see proliferation in this area. So it's very difficult to track compliance per law. It's much more comfortable to track it per control framework. And especially when we see that there are certain legal requirements emerging in the areas close to privacy, but traditionally not privacy. And this area is data ethics. And now I would like to bring an example from Denmark, where since recently data ethics, it became not just a voluntary internal requirement, but actually an external one as well. In June 2020, the Financial Statements Act has been updated in Denmark, and large unlisted companies are put under the legal obligation to report on their data ethics policies starting with the last financial year. So we're in a good place right now to actually review what has happened. The reporting obligations follow this well-known in the CSR area comply or explain principle, whereby in each financial statement, annual statement, the company has to say whether they have a data ethics policy in place, and if yes, to describe the policy, as well as, and it's very important to explain how the company works towards data ethics and what the results are. So this is our question of measuring comes in place. And then if they don't have the ethics policy, they might say they need to explain why they don't have one. So what I did, I reviewed 10 data ethics policies across top 20 largest listed companies by market cap to understand, I was really curious after talking to a lot of my Danish colleagues as to, what is the scope difference in comparison with privacy? What exactly is in those policies and kind of how to measure the performance to these very often abstract principles. So in terms of the scope of the policies, what we are saying and seeing, and here is the difference with privacy that comes in, is the fact that they are applicable to both personal and non-personal data. And many of the policies explicitly mention new technologies and AI. When it comes to principles that companies are committing to adhere to, I could calculate around 21 different principles across all these 10 policies. And kind of some mention 4 and others mention 10, but you can kind of group them in 21 different ones. Where transparency and openness is on the top of the list, responsible data sharing, fairness, non-discrimination, and many others. So a lot of similarities with GDPR. When it comes to governance or where the policies sit, that's quite interesting because half of them don't really mention who owns that from the corporate perspective. But in the rest of the half, we can see some differences. What generally seems to be the trend is that policy data ethics sits somewhere between privacy and compliance function and IT function, kind of shared between those two, sometimes almost covering both of them. And lastly, and that's the point of my discussion and this presentation, is measuring. Right, so we have these large principles. How do companies actually report on the progress of them? How do they operationalize them? And in this specific case, it seems that at least in the first year, the measurement is rather binary. The fact that the policy is in place seems to be an indicator that the company is doing well, but it's very, very unclear what are the indicators for the next of the years. So how do we know from data ethics perspective whether we're closer to transparency and openness goals, which are still defined in a very, very broad and kind of broad way? Only one company has committed to something specific, and this is the delivery of the ethics training, whereas for the rest, my prediction would be that we will see more ethics maturity frameworks tailored to the companies emerging, and clearly there will be a need to understand how they're going to integrate with the privacy maturity frameworks that all companies have, that many companies have right now. And if your privacy maturity framework is good, then at least data ethics commitments relevant to personal data could be integrated in a bit of an easier manner. So I think I'm out of time. Apologies for that, but that's the end of my presentation, and I really welcome your questions.
Thank you, Natalija. You really well managed the time, and we still have some time for one quick question. And I would like to look from practical perspective. How do you see the growing focus on data ethics, how it might change or how it might affect the everyday work of a privacy expert or privacy function or privacy lawyer? How do you see that?
Right. I think that matters where data ethics is actually placed in the company, whether it sort of is added to the data privacy portfolio or it's actually shared between the different corporate functions where kind of other people can also take a lead on that. And I think it would be a mistake just to place it in the privacy bucket because we have a big element of data ethics related to non-personal data handling. So that would be one point of how it can change. It can clearly increase the workload from a very practical perspective. But I think privacy function will have a very important role to play because privacy has been there in developing a lot of processes, the data that can be integrated with the data ethics processes as well. And just to mention one that has come up in a lot of policies that I analyzed from the Danish companies, that's called ethics by design. So, right, you can hear a bit of the similarities with the process that privacy pros know that well, data protection impact assessment of privacy by design. So I think what would be crucial, especially if data ethics sits somewhere else than privacy function, is to ensure that these processes are integrated rather than overlapping. And there will be quite some work needs to be done in order to make sure that kind of we have these coherent decision-making in the company.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for joining us.